Ryan Park, and I'm an associate professor of English at Biola University. I'm honored to be hosting a discussion for Biola's Center for Christianity, Culture, and the Arts. Today we're going to be discussing the topic of faith and fiction, especially how these two intersect and how Christian faith can inform the way we write or read works of literature. Let me introduce our panelists. Let me start with Ron Hansen on my far right. Ron Hansen is an award-winning novelist who has published 14 works, including Married in Ecstasy, Atticus, and Stay Against Confusion, Essays on Faith and Fiction. He currently teaches at Santa Clara University. Thanks, Ron, for being here. To my far left, we have Bo Caldwell, who is married to Ron Hansen. Bo Caldwell is also an award-winning novelist who has published 2 works, including national bestseller, The Distant Land of My Father, and her second novel, The City of Tranquil Light. She's currently working on her 3rd novel. Glad to have you, Bo.
Thank you.
To my immediate right, we have Natasha Duquette, who's an associate professor of English and chair of the English department at Biola University. Thanks, Natasha, for joining us. And on my left, we have Sandy Smith, who is also a professor of English at Biola University. Glad to have you here with us. So I want to start off with a question for each one of us. If you could comment or talk about a work of fiction that has had a particular spiritual significance in your life, and you could kind of broadly define spiritual in whatever way you would like. So let's start off with Ron.
There was a short story by John Updike called Pigeon Feathers. And it's about a young boy who's staying in his grandparents' farm. He discovers the Outline of History by H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells talks about Jesus as not a prophet, not a God at all, but just an ordinary wanderer. And this boy is really struck by that and disturbed. And the rest of the story is about his quandary about this. But then he's asked to go kill the pigeons inside of this barn, and he shoots them, and he sees them fall down. And something like the last line is, he marvels at the beauty of the pigeons, dead pigeons lying on the ground. And he said, it occurred to him that God, who had lavished such beauty on these worthless birds, would not let David live forever, or something like that. Would just the opposite. Would let
him die forever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it was a gorgeous story. It was eventually turned into a short film, but I always liked it. Yeah.
Great, thanks for sharing
Sure.
that. So Bo, would you like to share a work that has had a spiritual significance in your life?
I'll say Great Expectations, because it's so often what Pip thinks he wants and what he wants so desperately actually turns out not to be the right thing for him, not to be what his real heart wants. And the very thing that he kind of belittles and is afraid of and thinks nothing of, Magwitch, turns out to be the great giver of his life and where good things come from in his life. And I say that because in my own life, God is so often what I don't expect, and God's will is so often what I don't expect. When I was growing up, I thought that God's will meant wearing Laura Ashley dresses and teaching Sunday school and not really being myself. And instead, it's I think God truly wants me to be myself, and that's what I saw in Great Expectations.
Yeah, it's freeing to recognize that we can be ourselves and that we don't have to kind of perform a particular script.
And it's so much better than I can imagine. It's better than anything I could come up with on my own.
Okay, great, thank you. Natasha?
So beautiful. I'm going to say Tent of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. She's the lesser known of the Bronte sisters, and Tent of Wildfell Hall is a novel about choices and the choices we make being meaningful. So it's a story of a woman who's in an abusive marriage. She has a son, and then she chooses to go live on the Yorkshire moors in a place called Wildfell Hall and paint. And her brother, with her son, Arthur, and her brother comes periodically, gathers the paintings and takes them and sells them in London. And she survives this way. It's the courage of her choice that touches me and inspires me in that novel.
Great. Thank you. Sandy, would you like to share?
Hands down, Perelandra by C.S. Lewis. I first read it about 3 months after updating my conversion when I was 20 years old. And I was going through a period immediately after thinking, is this really valid? Is this really true? Am I just kidding myself? Is this, all the objections that people, the non-Christians, can bring up to conversion or to reaffirming a childhood commitment. And it was the updated conversion. And I went through a rather blue and bleak period in Minnesota midwinter, never seeing the sun. And then about 3 months later, I read Perelandra. And I was absolutely blown away by the book, by the story, and by Lewis's conception of an unfallen world and an unfallen person, the Green Lady. And immediately I thought, this is what I want, regardless of anything. And that got me through until the summer when I went to the university camp in Colorado, Bear Trap Ranch.
Okay.
And then on to Estes Park for a summer of
It's a
sort
beautiful
of friendship
place,
evangelism, and saw prayer answered for the very first time in my life there. So definitely Perelandra is it's my life-saving book.
Great, thank you. So the second question that I like to ask our panelists is, how has your faith shaped your vocation as a writer or what you write, whether that be short stories or novels or scholarly works? So if you could just comment on that, that would be very...
I think religious faith informs you that there's something going on here that matters. And that is what fiction should be about as well. That you look at each individual life and recognize God's goodness in that life and the potentiality for that life, and present that on the page.
Great, thank you.
I think it means I want to use whatever gifts I have well, and I want to use them for something that matters. And so when I was writing short stories more 20 years ago, I would write a short story that, just that sounds like a great story and kind of see where it led. And it wasn't that they weren't bad. But they feel to me now, looking back on, they feel kind of thin and maybe trivial because I think mainly because they didn't demand much from me. They didn't take much. And for me, I feel like that a work of writing, it takes some blood, it takes some struggling with, and it's a piece of me. And so I want to do that. I want whatever I'm working on to matter in that way to me and to feel. And that doesn't mean it has to be serious and not comic or anything like that. But it has to be something that I feel good about in that way.
Okay, great, thank you. Natasha?
Well, for some reason I'm thinking of a sonnet that I wrote, and it's just called San Juan Capistrano because it's about the San Juan Capistrano mission, but also the person who was San Juan Capistrano. And I wrote it in a time when I was really struggling, and then I read it. I was asked to read it in church, and this woman ran up to me afterwards, and I could see the joy. She said, "Oh, that first line, it moved me somehow." So I think that if we can write honestly, even if we're writing about something that's painful for us, it's a very encouraging to see it bring joy to others, to somehow bring joy to others out of our own pain. I don't know if that answers the... so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, great, thank you.
I've been listening to everyone, and I've forgotten what the question was.
So how has your faith shaped your vocation as a writer, whether that be creative piece or scholarly work?
Well, it would have to be mostly scholarly work. I've been drawn to working on writers that struck me in significant ways. For one sort of extreme example, I looked at a poem called Sunday Morning by Wallace Stevens, which you know the poem. It's his sort of paean to atheism and
Sure.
plowing on Sunday, and I could not help reading it as an argument, and then I couldn't help turning the argument against itself. So that's what I did, and but positively, I've written on Dry Manley Hopkins, on Günter Grass. The first article I presented at a conference was on Günter Grass's dog years, years ago, and the interesting use that he made of Baltic pagan chthonic deities in his. And I've written a couple of things on Lewis as well. I've been doing creative writing for a long time, since I was probably in high school, but nothing seems to have gelled that way. So I'm still kind of tinkering around with that.
So Natasha, I know you also have published specifically on faith in your scholarly work. Maybe you could also talk about how your faith informs the way you approach your scholarship.
Sure.
And
I'll talk about a chapter I co-wrote with my husband, since you two are here together. Thinking of that, it's called The Delicacy of Taste Redeemed, the aesthetic judgment and spiritual formation of Jane Austen's clergyman heroes. I know that's a mouthful, but it has a story behind it, in that Fred Duquette, my husband, he's been attending Talbot, doing a master's in theology, and they take spiritual formation classes. So he would come home and talk to me about spiritual formation. And I thought, gosh, that sounds like character development in a novel, when a novelist is creating their character and having them change over time. And so then we started talking about the clergymen in Jane Austen's novels who are not satirized, so not Mr. Collins or Mr. Elton, but the clergymen who the heroines actually marry at the end of the novel. So Henry Tilney, Edmund Bertram, Edward Ferrars. And we were talking about that. I was editing a collection on Jane Austen in the arts, and I thought about how the clergymen also form aesthetic judgments about music, art, landscape, and how their aesthetic judgments shift as they mature, and that are linked to their choice of wife and life partner by the end of the novel, and a wise choice in each case. So that was so fun, and I think it did make Fred and I think of our marriage and our journey, our faith journey together as we were working on it. Yeah, I can't divorce my faith from my scholarship. It would be impossible for me, and from my life experience. Yeah.
And it seems like the collaborative element was also essential in that project of writing it with your husband.
Yeah, and I'm doing so much more collaborative teaching now too. I think that is the biblical model, is collaborative teaching and thinking and discussing, and Bunyan calls it godly discourse, this idea, even what we're doing right now, that some of the best literature or thought arises from conversation and joint efforts. Yeah.
So would you say there's a particular theology or theological concept that informs your the way that you approach your work as a writer? Could you talk about that?
I think of that phrase, I'm going to say it's by origin, but it might not be. God gives us just enough to seek Him, but never enough to fully find Him. Okay. And I think my explorations as a fiction writer is to try and get other glimpses of God through the people I'm writing about, or through nature, or all those things. So they're explorations, but their goal is God.
Okay. So, and also in a kind of an alternative understanding of the way that we see life, or even our ideas of God.
Yeah.
Kind of like what you were talking about. Bo, would you like to share? Is there kind of a theological idea or concept that?
Well, they've both said, writing and faith are very intertwined for me.
Okay.
And I used to think, in that kind of Laura Ashley phase, I was thinking that writing and faith would mean that I wrote quote unquote Christian fiction, and that everything was explicitly about God and the God of a certain way and all that.
Yeah.
And now it feels like it's just very intertwined, kind of deep within me. And so if I'm paying attention and if I'm seeking God, then I trust more that my writing instincts will be on that right track. And there are two, I'm somebody who, I don't really want to write a novel if I can't do it in a day. I want things done, and it's hard to go back and know that it's going to be a while, and today I'm going to, maybe write a couple of paragraphs and all that. And there are two things that really help me with that. I also like to know what's going to happen. I like to know at the dinner party who I'm going to be seated next to and what time I'm going to get to go home, being an introvert. And there are two things that really help me with that. One is, it's a very well-known quote about writing by E.L. Doctorow. Writing a novel is like driving the car at night. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. I may have a word off, but that's it. And also, Anne Lamott, in her wonderful book about writing called Bird by Bird, the title comes from her brother, when he was a kid, had to write do a school project about like all the birds of something, of the state or something, some massive thing. And of course he didn't start till like the night before. And he was panicked and afraid, and her father said to him, just do it bird by bird, buddy, bird by bird. And that applies, I use that in my writing life very much, just bird by bird, just do what I can today, one day at a time, just do those couple of paragraphs and trust that, like manna, what I need for tomorrow will be there.
Okay, that's good.
So a theology that is informing our writing process.
Maybe perhaps sacramentalism or incarnation, the idea, any of those, does it, in some sense, inform your writing?
So I don't know if this is a theology. So right now I'm working on a monograph about women interpreting scripture through their poetry. And as I was talking about my poem, I realized the reason that I'm interested in that is because that's kind of what I'm doing. But these are women in the past, 18th century, early 19th century. The theology, they have varied theological perspectives. Some are Presbyterian women writers, some are Congregationalists, Moravian, Methodist. But I think I'm not trying to restrict them to each theology, but rather see what they have in common across their theological differences. Theology of freedom of voice to even speak outside of a specific church context. This is my own ideas.
There's a scene in Marilyn Robinson's novel, Gilead, where the main character talks about Calvin, one of Calvin's writing, where Calvin has this image of not thinking about God in a kind of morally, in an immoral way, but more in terms of aesthetic way. What if we see God as a director, kind of seeing us play our role? How well do we perform our role? So it's a very interesting idea of having God as an audience.
There's one of the women in my book, Joanna Bailey. She wrote in a letter to her friend, Mary Berry, I write for God and not for man. And so I was thinking of using that as an epigraph for my book. I think these women were writing in relationship to God and not worrying that much about their communities. In some cases, their communities were a bit resistant to their voices. Yeah. Devotional is the word I was thinking of, kind of devotional theology.
I think of Hopkins, who wrote to one of his former instructors who was a minister, and he had written a book of poems and been roundly ignored. Hopkins, of course, was not getting his poetry published, and so he wrote in sympathy to this person, and he said, Christ is the only literary critic. Basically saying, it doesn't matter what all these other people say because they're lesser. It's what God says.
And even George Herbert, when he wrote his series, The Temple, and he gave it to his friend right before he died, he said, publish this if you think it will help any poor struggling soul in their own devotional life. Yeah.
Okay. Well, my next question is related to the previous question that I asked, and that's, how do you write about faith or write God into literature without being heavy-handed? So often Christians are accused of having an agenda and so forth. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how you approach literature and write about faith without that sort of heavy-handed.
I think of how there's old saying, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And that the problem with the kind of fiction you're describing is there's so much certainty behind it. It doesn't give room to humanity.
Okay.
And so in some ways it's untrue.
Okay. So art asks the questions in some sense,
Right.
without providing a kind of definitive answers.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. It's a really good approach.
I was really worried about that. My second novel is about missionaries in China, and I was really worried about that. I was worried about it being, Christian fiction in that special section of the bookstore, where I'm not putting all of those books down, but the ones I looked at seemed so formulaic, and it seemed like the cheap was, in some of them, the cheap was kind of faith. The faith was cheap. They hadn't really grappled and that kind of thing. And indeed, I made that mistake in the first 80 pages of the novel when I was writing it early on, that everything was predictable and my characters didn't really struggle, and there wasn't really at stake. Their faith wasn't really at stake.
Okay.
Something bad happened and they said, but we knew God would provide. But it wasn't enough going on. And for me, the answer to it was surrender. I had to surrender to what the book really was, and my characters had to surrender to what life brought and all kinds of things, and it opened it up for me. But I think the more the book is explicitly about faith, like Marietta in Ecstasy or Exiles and City of Tranquil Light, the harder it is. And you have to, I had to kind of make sure that it was really authentic and that it wasn't just wrapping things up.
Okay. And there's a lot of historical research that went into it, and kind of giving an authentic context of that missionary life.
And reading lots of missionary biographies and autobiographies, and reading about how these people, their real struggles, not just how big the churches were and how many converts and all that, but these people, babies died and spouses died, and it was a very tough life. And so their faith was, their lives were very real, and their faith was very real as a result of it.
Yeah. There's a theologian by the name of Trevor Hart who talks about the Christian faith as eucatastrophic, that Christianity acknowledges and recognizes the profoundly tragic dimensions of life, but also sees a possibility of hope. And these two kind of need to be in tension. In some sense, it's kind of what you're acknowledging there, that you can't jump to redemption and hope immediately, that there has to be kind of an authentic process of recognizing struggles and questioning and doubt, and that's kind of what I saw in your book and City of Tranquil Light. And these two have to kind of be in tension and not at the cost of one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the other question that I wanted to ask was, the critic Paul Elie wrote in one of his essays that there's been a dearth of a truly substantive scenes of faith in contemporary literature. Is he right?
Totally disagree.
Okay.
we weren't crazy about that essay at our house.
Well, part of the problem was that he was my editor for Exiles.
Oh, okay.
And how can you say that when the book is riddled with questions of faith and doubts about whether any of this matters? And so I didn't get it. And a lot of my friends actually wrote letters against that essay. Yeah. But you don't think that, do you?
No, I don't. I mean, I think of even writers like Ian McEwan, Atonement. I mean, that's even though he's an atheist, it's a deeply kind of, I think it raises questions of faith, and a deeply spiritual book in many respects. And so even, people who don't subscribe to Christian faith, I mean, I think they do address
I know, I'm thinking
spirituality
of
and
Margaret
faith.
Atwood has a novel called Alias Grace, and it's about a servant who's accused of murdering the master of the home that she was serving in 19th century Ontario in Canada. And it's left a mystery. Speaking of certainty, you don't know by the end of the novel if she did or not. You have to decide or leave it as a mystery. But there's a scene where she sings a hymn in jail, and so it makes me think of Paul singing hymns in jail. And I mean, it's very hard, her time in jail. Atwood is not sentimentalizing this at all, but for some reason, because it's Atwood, I accept that scene of her singing the hymn in jail with all of her brokenness. So I think it's correct that even writers who are not Christian are writing believable scenes of faith, especially in historical fiction. You can't avoid it.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of writers like Cormac McCarthy, The Road. I mean, that is I think, profoundly theological, spiritual book. One could read it that way. And I mentioned Gilead's, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead.
John Irving, who's not terribly religious, writes A Prayer for All and Meaning about religious faith.
Lovely.
So, no, yeah, I think contemporary literature is rife with substance scenes of faith. So
Yeah, I think he was looking for something more specific, like the rebirth of Flannery O'Connor.
And just a much narrower definition of what qualified. Yeah, I think when you broaden it out a little bit, as you're saying, that there are all kinds of examples.
Yeah, that's very heartening. So, Ron, you write in one of your essays that all writing provides occasions of encounter between human beings and God. Do you think there's a limit to this idea? Can it be applied to literature that is overwhelmingly pessimistic and dark?
Well, I said provides occasions for, but it doesn't mean it actually hits.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an
so
important
they
qualification.
could encounter God or understand more about humanity and our place in the world, and sometimes they don't. They're just perverse in their views of the world.
Natasha, do you have comments on that? Because you were asking
I guess I'm
about
just
that
thinking
question.
of very, even very gritty realism written by someone who's not a Christian. If it's reflecting reality somehow, and God created reality, can provide these kind of occasions. It's a very redemptive idea that is appealing to me, and that I have seen in teaching literature here. Sometimes what could appear to be a dark, some of the literature that's come out of Africa in the latter part of the 20th century, even maybe an account of child soldiers. This actually provides more occasion for the students because they're like, this is so refreshingly honest, and they're so aware of suffering in the world today because of the internet, and they feel it. And so it's almost a relief to them if they get some kind of darker account of suffering because it strikes them as honest, and then we can talk about that from a theological perspective. Yeah.
Irenaeus said the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And to be fully alive doesn't mean to be fully happy. You can be fully sad, and it's the novelist or anybody's willingness to address the real conditions of life that are the glory of God.
Okay.
It's so interesting because I was thinking when we lapse into what we might call Christianese in our writing, you were the Laura Ashley's, I really related to that way of phrasing that. Sometimes it's because we are being either lazy and not wanting to grapple with the reality of things, or we're trying to anesthetize some kind of pain of our own or spare others. But I have found, especially in teaching, that the students don't want us to edit the world. No, why would they want, so we might be trying to spare ourselves pain or spare someone else. But I'll just come back to that sonnet. I wrote that sonnet when my husband had just been diagnosed with prostate cancer, and I was really facing that, and I was distraught. And I poured it into the sonnet, and I was like angry at God. And then somehow it brought that woman at church joy. So in not holding back, it's better for the audience. Yeah.
I remember that essay.
Okay.
And I remember that line because I really took it to heart, because it went against my earlier beliefs about how narrow how narrow it would, my writing would be if I were following God. You know, I thought that meant kind of a box. But I've found, you know, the more I spend time with God, the older I get, he just gets bigger. He's big. And so to me that means that what I write is always capable. It's always possible for it to be about grace and about God, and to have those things in it, whether I know it or not, and it can be, it doesn't have to ever mention God, but it can be there. And so it's a very hopeful thing to me that I don't have to be writing about these certain things and use this certain vocabulary, that it's there. If I allow it to be, it's there, and you know, things can, I mean, some people say the writer is the last person to write about a book, to ask about a book. Maybe not write it, but ask about it. And so, you know, we write all kinds of things that we don't know are there and that readers bring to it, like the woman at church. You know, big things are possible if I get out of the way.
Yes.
I don't want to be contrarian, but one thing that I grapple with as a writer is the knowledge that whereas my reason assents to revelation, and whereas in my, you know, my heart of hearts in my life, you know, the Holy Spirit has taken up residence in my life, all right? Nevertheless, how much, to what extent do I trust my imagination to bring up, you know, good stuff? Because the imagination, the will, the desires, these are the most fallen part of us. It wasn't by an appeal to reason that Satan tripped up Adam and Eve in the garden. It was by an appeal to desire, an appeal to imagination. You shall be as gods. So I wonder how much I, at least as a writer, to what extent I can really trust my fallen imagination and my desperately wicked and deceitful heart. If I could just sort of throw that question out.
Well, I think trust is a proper word, and I trust that with my own connection with God and my own desire for deeper communication, that is going to emanate through my fiction no matter what I'm writing about. And if I didn't trust that, then I would be incapable of writing, because I would distrust the imagination. But I think that God is not going to let that go awry.
And I can really feel it when I don't want God involved. Whether I want to go get mad at somebody, I want to sit in some resentment, I don't want to ask God's opinion. My mom had a very strong faith, and she said, sin is telling God, I'll call you, don't call me. And another friend tells me that we don't always know when we do something right, but we always know when we do something wrong. And if I am careful in looking at myself, and I spend quiet time in the morning, I have solitude and I listen, I can kind of tell, you know, maybe not that right away, maybe I write a scene or something, and then I realize it's not coming from the right place. And maybe it's about ego. That's a problem for me in writing. You know, sometimes I want to show off. I want to put in too many facts to show you how much work I did, or, you know. And so I look at that, and it's kind of either listening to myself as I'm writing, or looking at it a day later or a week later, or whatever, and seeing, is this my best self, and is this really what I want it to be? But I do know what you mean, and I think the earlier stories I wrote, they weren't awful stories or anything. They weren't bad in that way, morally or anything, but they just, God was here and the stories were here, and I didn't they didn't meet. And I didn't ask his help or his opinion or anything. I just did what I wanted. And so it has to be, I have to involve him. And
that goes
helps.
back to your this posture that you have, humility and involving God in the very act of writing itself.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm aware some days of, I don't really want his opinion. And I'm getting better at catching it, whether it's, like I said, staying mad at somebody or saying something unkind, or writing and just not worrying about, am I involving God in this process, or am I asking him to wait outside, please?
Yeah.
Recently, there's been a strong interest in magical realism, the fabulous, and the mythic. What might be the significance of this trend, do you think, this interest in the mythic and the fabulous and the magical realism?
It seems to me that they're getting back to the origins of literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that whole idea of transporting people out of their daily humdrum existence and letting them think of, even in supernatural terms, as in the Iliad, about what's going on. And there are all these motivations and causalities that we don't know how to grapple with.
Right.
And it's easier to do it in a fantastic and magical realistic mode.
Any other thoughts on that question?
Well, with that question, I think of another Canadian novelist named Thomas King. He has a novel, Green Grass Running Water, and he's half Greek, half Cherokee. So, you know, and he has some Orthodox, so he's got Orthodox background, but then also this native spirituality informing his writing. And I think it's maybe the complexity of his own experience resists the strict realism that doesn't allow for the spiritual or the magic realism. I do think he's trying to say something about the indigenous population existing in North America kind of beyond our peripheral vision, and we're not aware of that, and it's like an alternate reality. So he uses magic realism to depict that in really interesting and honestly fun ways. So a gift of that novel is he is grappling with some history of suffering of indigenous people in North America, yet it's a delight. It's a delight to read because of this wondrous aspect of the magic realism.
Yeah. And I'm struck by what Ron said, that there's almost a search for transcendent.
Yes.
That we're looking for something beyond the ordinary, the mundane, and the purely realistic. That there's something about the search for transcendent within our culture that I think it's a kind of a vibrant sign.
I think we know that intuitively, and so that's resonating with people right now on a very basic level. It's like they're thirsty for that.
Yeah. Can you think of a work that does that particularly well?
I mean, I thought of Gabriel Garcia Marquez right away. And when I was teaching and I taught one of his stories, you know, the kids undergrads just kind of lit up at it. And it's it can be a little bit seductive because it looks easy. And it looks like, you know, you can just make it up. And it's much harder than that. I think it's harder than, you know, than realistic fiction to create this world where there's still rules. You have to have some kind of rules about how things work and everything, but it's very attractive. And I think it appeals to, you know, I think to students, it felt like kind of a breath of fresh air. And the way it affects me sometimes is kind of, it evokes kind of a childlike response. I get kind of excited. And I think it's really hard to do, but I do feel that when I read Garcia Marquez, you know, kind of, it feels like something very new, but it's still going to have the good stuff.
Yeah, almost, and I noticed that about the Gothic tradition as well. My students are very interested in the Gothic tradition.
In some Gothic novels, the truth coming through dreams and these kind of possibilities.
Right.
The surreal, yeah. So how does literature help us understand the value of small and insignificant objects? And maybe you could kind of expound on that.
This is my question for you, coming from your book about faith and fiction and the part about Saint Ignatius and his shoe.
Yeah,
You talk about holding his small shoe, and
about the size of my hand.
yeah, that was my favorite part of that whole chapter. So I wanted to know, as writers, objects and the significance of concrete objects and how that comes into play when you're working on a novel.
Well, in Mariette and Ecstasy, I began each section with kind of what I thought of as a God's eye view of nature, and paying particular attention to the smallest of things, mosquitoes landing on water, you know. And I thought that was a way of then moving from the macrocosm to the microcosm of these women within a convent, and showing that in some ways all these things around us are to be revered and seen as part of God's handwriting.
It's lovely. There's like a real gentleness to that, I think, but that's tied to the sublime and the transcendent at the same time. And did you think about that?
Well, I'm working on a novel that has to do with archaeology, and so I've learned a lot about, and I'm focusing on Byzantine archaeology and Byzantine sites. So I've learned a lot. You know, I have lists of like what you would find at a Byzantine site. You know, a lantern and a hook and a nail and all this stuff. I have lists of those. And as I was writing, I've been working on this. About a year ago, I went back to Oklahoma City, where my daughter has settled, and it's where I was born and where my dad's family lived, and some of them still live there. And I hadn't been there for a long time. And I drove around the city and found the house where my dad grew up, which I hadn't seen since I was a little kid. And I got out of the car, and there's just a parking lot or a park next door, and so I was right up against the fence, and I found a kind of an old brick, just a piece, and I brought it home with me. And it's probably not from the house or even from the land, but it was close enough. And as I was, I put it in my study, and as I was looking at it, I thought, oh, it's archaeology. This is a relic to me. And so that's, to me, what I don't understand the process or why I do it exactly, but the things in my study that I look at when I'm writing are very important to me, and they're charged. And they're things that I want. They have either good memories for me or significance. There's a sculpture that my mom did, and there's that. And as I said, as I learned about archaeology, I thought, oh, these are important pieces of my past and my parents' past, and I want them near me. They're powerful to me, not in a magical way, but you know, they can mean a lot to me. And when you find, you know, something like my dad's keychain, I mean, that's a holy thing to me. I know how it sounded when he came home from work every day. And you know, I think they can be really wonderful gifts to us beyond their just day-to-day meanings.
Yeah, and how memory is located in these particular objects. I'm thinking of my favorite novel, Gilead, where the father of the main character gives him biscuit. There's a burnt church, and the children are sort of underneath the cart, just kind of waiting for the rain to stop. And the father comes and gives the son this ashy biscuit, and that's what he remembers as communion. And it's kind of a powerful scene where that one particular object releases this memory of that event and his father. And so
I think
forth.
to me it's also about that the ordinary is holy. I was reading a piece of a couple of paragraphs from Frederick Buechner this morning, and I think it was from Godric, and he's helping to slaughter a pig, and it gets into more detail than I wanted, but someone comes to him after she's watching him do this, and she said something like, "Smirchy and holy, it's all the same," something like that, and that she says, "You prepared the pig as though you were preparing communion." And you know, I think the ordinary is so holy when you're paying attention. You know, the kitchen and these things, God is infused in all of that, not just at church.
Sounds like Brother Lawrence, doesn't it?
Yes, I love Brother Lawrence.
And also Pied Beauty by Hopkins.
Right.
So the world's charged with the grandeur of God, but even on the dapples on the side of a
Right.
trout, these tiny details.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of someone like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who kind of relocated the sacred space to the kitchen, you know, rather than the seminary or halls of Congress. It's in the kitchen that where all these significant conversations and events took place. So
Years ago, I was going through a hard time, and I was going through a divorce, and I lived in a little cottage with my kids, and it was a tumultuous time. And we didn't have a dishwasher or a garbage disposal, and I would, sometimes I'd let the dishes pile up and then finally do this mountain of them. And it was almost a sure thing that I would feel God so strongly when I was doing those dishes, whether I'd prayed, whether I'd felt like I'd been good or bad that day, but just the focus of doing that, and it was almost, it almost became I came to depend on it almost, that I could just feel His presence so strongly, washing dishes by hand.
It's so interesting. When I was a graduate student, I was working on my PhD. I lived in a basement apartment in Ontario. They don't have them here because in California, with the earthquakes, we don't have basement apartments. But a tiny basement apartment, but we had a little garden. There were there were 3 apartments in the building, and there were other graduate students, and we all gardened in the back together. And I had no dishwasher, so I would wash my dishes by hand. And I remember having just a little bowl and going and getting some baby lettuce and basil and tomatoes straight from the garden and eating that simple meal. And I was very close to God at that time. And I did some of my best writing at that time when I was living so simply. Yes. I go back to that time because we get distracted when our lives become more complicated.
the last question that I have for us is maybe talking about a powerful image. The most powerful literature often begins with an image. Could you think of an image that has remained with you or stuck with you? I'm thinking in particular for me is At the End of the Road by Cormac McCarthy. The image of the trout, it was just kind of appeared suddenly, unexpectedly, and it has always stayed with me in this kind of a bleak world of post-apocalyptic landscape, this ashen world, this image of just a trout. And so I was wondering if all of us could share an image that has remained with you.
Boo Radley.
Okay.
Toward the end of To Kill a Mockingbird, when Jem has been injured and he's in the bedroom, and Scout's there, and there's Boo behind the door, the man she's been afraid of and fascinated with for this summer. And she looks and she recognizes him, though I don't think she's seen him before. She looks and she says, "Hey, Boo." And Atticus corrects her and says, "Say hello to Mr. Radley." He said, "Mr. Radley, I believe you know my children," or something like that. Okay. But it's this moment of recognition, which is what I was talking about earlier with Magwitch too. They're my two favorites. That what she was afraid of is her friend. And that she knows it. This child knows it, and she doesn't make a big deal of it. She says, "Hey, Boo." That's just been true so much in my life, and I think it's very profound that she knows it when she sees it, and that her fears fall away, and that it's in her home. It's in her very place where there's pain and protection in her home, and she knows it. I like that.
It's a recognition that kind of leads to a transformation in some sense.
She walks him home.
Yeah,
everything does a 180 then. She walks him home and she kind of protects him. And she goes to his porch and see what his life is like, stands in his shoes. Yeah. And I really like that.
One of my favorite poems in the English language is by Dylan Thomas, "The Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London." And in there he says, the synagogue in an ear of corn. And I was really struck by that when I first encountered it, that nature itself can somehow lead us to worship of God. And the whole poem is riddled with religious imagery. And the refusal to mourn the death by fire is basically that this child is probably in heaven, so you don't need to mourn that child. Okay. But it's also saying that so much of the world is holy that we just disregard.
Okay. So attentiveness to the small things of the world, the ordinary that we talked about, that's so important for a writer and a reader. Yeah.
I know, so mine Mine is from a poem that I memorized when I was about 13. My mother encouraged me to memorize this poem, and it's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by Wordsworth. I know it's a bit cheesy, but those daffodils tossing their head in sprightly dance, it stayed with me ever since I was 13. And I remember going to the Lake District and seeing the daffodils, but also the foxgloves, and being astonished by the wealth. Wordsworth calls it a wealth of the flowers. But can I add one more?
Sure, yeah.
I'm going to add a Paul Buchanan image. Paul has a novel called The Last Place I Wanted to Be, and it's
Paul Buchanan teaches
Paul
at
Buchanan is a professor of creative writing here at Biola, and the novel is written from the perspective of a teenage girl, and she's living in the city, but her parents buy an old bed and breakfast that's kind of run down on the north coast and take her there from the city to this little resort town, and that's why it's the last place I wanted to be. And it's Paul's description of that bed and breakfast has stayed with me because it has this almost gothic rambling feel to it, but it's full of potential because the family has kind of on a whim decided to buy it and just move out there and start afresh. And I like the image of the building kind of decrepit and it's falling apart and ramshackle, but full of hope for the future. I like that.
Hands down, it's the floating islands of Perelandra. That is, it's something in my head a lot. I've already explained the importance of the book to me. When I sit down to write, it almost defeats me because it is so evocative of a perfection that I just don't think I can reach, and yet an object of really sort of ultimate, desire. And so it's both, it's aspiration and challenge all at the same time for me. But yeah, it's my image.
That's great. Natasha, your comment about Paul's image of this house, that it's decrepit, but there's possibility and hope. It reminded me of the ways in which literature could kind of put those two together, the tragic dimension and hope, in tension with each other. So I'd like to ask all of our panelists if you could think of a work that does that particularly well, that really explores both the tragedy and hope, and see the tension, and I'm thinking in particular of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where he does that so well, that he acknowledges the deeply, almost nihilistic phase that the main character goes through, but he also discovers hope toward the end of the novel. Are there works that you think that does
a
particularly
song,
well?
actually, by Leonard Cohen. It's kind of a psalm, and he wrote it during a very tough time. It's called If It Be Your Will. And if it be your will that I should sing from this broken hill, then I'll sing to you. And he keeps referring to Broken Hill, and it's obviously not only a place where he's living, but he thought of himself as a broken hill. And it's just an appeal. Let me sing, let me continue to write songs and all those things, if it be your will. Otherwise, I'll be silent. And it's a beautiful song.
His songs do that particularly well. I'm thinking of Hallelujah as well.
Right.
That there is that note of sadness, but also hope at the same time.
Also, Bird on a Wire. He says, like a bird on a wire, like a drunk in a midnight choir,
Right.
I've tried in my way to be free.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous, but sad.
Yeah. Chris Christopherson asked to have that on his tombstone.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Because actually, honestly, what came to my mind with Hans' question is elegy written in a country churchyard, and it ends with an epitaph. Death, but also somehow pointing towards eternity at the same time.
Well, I was thinking novels, but since he said a song, I'll go with poetry. John Berryman, Address to the Lord. and he starts out Master of the Universe, and he's asking for God's help, and it's very humble, and he's saying, I don't really believe, but those, this miracle might have been just kind of a special case, but I ask for your help. And he says, he makes a reference to the fact that some of his friends are no longer standing, but he is. And then if you know how Berryman's life ended, it's a very brave and sad and poignant thing. And he asks, he said, I'm paraphrasing it terribly, but something like at the end, I think you might even help me again if I ask. And it's so heartfelt, and without saying a lot about it, you can see the depth of this man's struggles in just a few words. But he's asking again. He's asking for help again, despite everything.
Okay.
And it's in front of me on my desk, so I should know it by now. But I look at it every day, and it kind of is my start.
Yeah, mine would be Tolstoy's Resurrection novel. It's a novel about a young army officer who seduces and betrays a girl. She gets pregnant, and she's then ostracized and left to support herself and her infant child as best she can, drives her into a life of prostitution and crime. Years later, he shows up at her trial when she's being sentenced and being exiled to Siberia, and he's so conscience-stricken that he joins this draft of prisoners that's being sent to Siberia on foot. And day after day after day after day, and the camps where they stop and everything. And showing the change that occurs in him and the possibility for new life that this girl finds. I mean, they never reconcile. He's very apologetic, and he supports her as best he can, financially and moral support, but but that's okay with him, because he feels that that's what he deserves, if I'm remembering it correctly anyway. And so at the end, it's a different life for her, but you realize that it's a cleaner, stronger, and better life that she's found. And he has been profoundly changed by the experience. And so, yeah, I mean, there's just some, grief-striking elements in the novel. And yet, out of all that ruin, the possibility that people can change and that people's lives can change.
Yeah, and that reminds me actually of your first novel. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Distant Land is based on the life of an uncle of mine who made a lot of mistakes and bad decisions and turned his back on his family. And at the end of his life, he tried to make amends and repair that damage. And he did, to an extent. He did as much as he could. And he didn't get everything that he wanted as far as a relationship with his son, but he went a long way. So the novel tells that story, but with a daughter. And people tell me, I cried for the last 30 pages or whatever, and I keep saying, well, it's good crying, right? It is painful, and I've had women talk to me who's had tough relationships with their fathers, and sometimes it's painful for them, and sometimes it's healing. But someone told me that the book helped to really heal the family, and that means more to me than anything. So
yeah, there's a communion that's created in reading, and someone said that we read to know that we're not alone, and certainly I think we've all experienced that in sharing some of our favorite works and novels. So thank you all for participating in this conversation.
thank you.
Enjoy it.